1. For Sherlock Holmes she is always the woman. I have rarely heard her mentioned by any other name. In his eyes, she dwarfs the rest of the fairer sex. Not that I have felt for Irene Adler an emotion that can be compared to love. All emotions, and that one in particular, are opposed to his cold, precise, but admirably balanced mind. It is, I can assure you, the most perfect observation and reasoning machine the world has ever seen, but as a lover, Sherlock Holmes had been in an entirely false position. He never spoke of the passions, even the mildest, without a trace of mockery and contempt. They were admirable things to behold, excellent for piercing the veil of men's motives and actions. But to the prepared reasoner to admit such intrusions into his own carefully adjusted temperament was to introduce a factor which would distract and unbalance all delicate mental results. A rubbish in a sensitive instrument or a crack in a very fine lens would not have been more damaging than an intense emotion in a nature like his. And yet, for him there was only one woman, and that woman was the late Irene Adler, of dubious and cloudy memory. She had seen little of Holmes lately. My marriage had pushed us apart. My own happiness, and the domestic interests that spring up around the man who finds himself for the first time master of his house, were sufficient to absorb all my attention, while Holmes, who hated any form of society with all his bohemian soul, remained in our rooms in Baker Street, immersed in his old books, and alternating, from week to week, between cocaine with ambition, drug drowsiness, with the fierce energy of his own restless nature. He continued, as always, deeply interested in the study of crime and using his immense faculties and his extraordinary powers of observation to follow the clues and solve the mysteries that had been abandoned by the official police, as hopeless cases. From time to time I heard some vague account of his exploits, his involvement in the Trepoff murder case in Odessa, its solution in the singular tragedy of the Atkinson brothers, at Trincomalee, and, finally, in the mission he had carried out, with such success, for the ruling family of Holland. However, beyond these samples of activity, which I was determined to share with all the readers of the daily press, I knew very little about my former friend and colleague. One night, it was March 20, 1888, I was returning from visiting a patient. I had returned to the exercise of my profession as a civilian physician, when my journey home forced me to pass through Baker Street. As I passed through that door so familiar to me, which will always be associated in my mind with the time of my courtship and with the dark incidents in the study in scarlet, I was filled with an intense desire to see Holmes and to know how he was using, now, his extraordinary faculties. His rooms were brilliantly lit. Looking up at them, I noticed her tall, slender figure pass twice, turned into a black silhouette, near the curtain. She was pacing the room quickly, anxiously, her head on her chest and her hands clasped behind her back. For me, who knew in depth each of his habits and his moods, his attitude and behavior were revealing. I was working again. He had been shaken from his reveries. Drug addicts and was on the hot trail of some new case. I rang the bell and was led into the room that I had shared with Sherlock for so long. He wasn't very effusive. It rarely was, but I think he was glad to see me. Almost without a word, though with a kindly twinkle in his eyes, he motioned me to an easy chair, tossed his pack of cigarettes at me, and pointed to a bottle of whiskey in a siphon on top of a dresser. Then he stood in front of the fire and looked at me with his peculiar attention. "Marriage suits you," he told me. "I think, Watson, that you have gained about 7.5 pounds since we have not seen each other." 7, I answered. I should have thought a little more before saying that. And I see that he is exerting himself again. She hadn't told me she was trying to pursue her profession. Then how do you know? I see it, I deduce it. How do I know that you've been getting a lot of exposure to the rain lately and that you have a clumsy and careless maid? My dear Holmes, I protested, this is too much. If he had lived a few centuries ago, he would have died at the stake for witchcraft. It is true that on Thursday I went out for a walk in the country and came home drenched, but I have changed my clothes and I cannot imagine how you deduce this. As for Mary Jane, she is incorrigible, and my wife has sent her away, nor can I imagine how he managed to guess it. Holmes smiled to himself and rubbed his long, nervous hands together. It's simplicity itself. My eyes tell me that on the outside of your left shoe, exactly where the light shines best, the skin is roughly scratched in 6 places, making parallel lines. Obviously this has been caused by someone trying to remove the mud that covered the shoe, but doing it with positive clumsiness, without any care. Hence my double deduction that he was exposed to the rain and that he has a particularly incompetent specimen of the evil London servitude. As to the practice of his profession, if a gentleman came into this room smelling of iodoform, with a black stain of silver nitrate on his right forefinger and a protrusion on the side of his top hat, showing where he had hidden his stethoscope, he would need to be very foolish not to declare him an active member of the medical profession. I could help but laugh at the ease with which he explained his deductions. When I hear you explain your reasoning, I remarked, the question always seems so ridiculously simple that I feel sure I could easily have made the same deductions as you. However, with each new case of his seemingly strange powers that comes my way, I am baffled until he explains the process that followed. And yet I think I have as good eyes as you. It's possible, he answered, lighting a cigarette and dropping into an armchair. You see, but you do not observe. The distinction is perfectly clear. For example, you have often seen the staircase that leads from the hall to this room. Indeed. How often? Well, several hundred times. Then you can tell me how many there are. How many steps? I don't know. Now do you understand? You have not observed, despite having seen. That's what I wanted to tell you. Now, I know that there are 17 steps, because I have seen and observed. By the way, since you are interested in these little problems and have been kind enough to publish 1 or 2 of my experiences, you might like to see this. He handed me a sheet of thick paper, a soft shade of pink, which had been until then on the table. It arrived in the afternoon mail. Read it out loud. The note had no date, no signature, and no address of the sender. He said. Then I beg you to ask your question, said Holmes, closing his eyes once more. The facts, in particular, are the following. About 5 years ago, during a prolonged visit to Warsaw, I became acquainted with the well-known adventurer Irene Adler. The name is undoubtedly familiar to you. Please see what my forefinger says about her, Doctor, Holmes murmured without opening his eyes. For many years he had adopted the system of annotating all the paragraphs referring to men and things that appeared in the newspapers, in such a way that it was difficult to mention a subject or a person without his having immediate access to information about it. In this case, I found the biography of the woman between that of a Hebrew rabbi and that of a sailor who had written a monograph on the fish that inhabit the deep seas. Let me see. Holmes exclaimed. He was born in New Jersey in the year 1858. Contralto, La Scala, Prima donna of the Warsaw Imperial Opera, yes. Withdrawal from the scene, aha. Living in London currently, that's it. Your Majesty, I understand, mixed up with this young lady, wrote her some compromising letters, and is now anxious to get those letters back. Precisely. But how? Was there a secret marriage? No. No legal papers or certificates? Neither. Then, I fail to understand His Majesty. If this young woman presented her letters for blackmail, or for any other purpose, how was she going to prove their authenticity? For writing. Bah! Forged. My private roll. Stolen. My own label. Imitated. My photography. Purchased. We are both in the photograph. Oh, my gosh. That is terrifying. Her Majesty committed a tremendous indiscretion by photographing herself like this. I was in love, crazy. He is very seriously committed. Back then I was just a prince. Was young. Even now I am only 30 years old. That photograph must be recovered. We have tried to do it, and we have failed. Your Majesty will have to pay. It must be bought. She won't sell it. Stolen then. 5 attempts have been made. On 2 occasions, thieves in my service have searched his house. Once we stole his luggage when he was traveling. Twice it has been searched by women paid by me. Without result. There are no traces of the portrait. Absolutely none. Holmes laughed. It's a rather complicated little problem, he said. And very serious to me, replied the king reproachfully. A lot, actually. And what do you intend to do with photography? Ruin me. But how? I'm about to get married. That's what I've known. With Clotilde Lothman von Saxe-Meiningen, second daughter of the King of Scandinavia. Perhaps you know the strict principles of your family. She herself is the personification of finesse. A shadow of doubt as to my conduct would put an end to our betrothal. And Irene Adler? He threatens to send them the photograph. And it will. I know very well that it will. You don't know her, but she has a soul of steel. She has the face of the most beautiful of women and the mind of the most resolute of men. In order to prevent me from marrying another woman, there are no lengths to which she would not be able to go, there are not. Are you sure you haven't sent it yet? I'm sure. Why? Because he told me that he would send it the day the marriage was publicly proclaimed. That will be next Monday. Oh, then we have 3 days yet, said Holmes with a yawn. It is a great fortune, as I have 1 or 2 matters of importance to attend to at the moment. Her Majesty will, of course, spend a few days in London, won't she? Indeed. You will find me at the Langham, under the name of Count von Cram. Then I will visit you to notify you of the progress of our inquiries. I beg you to do it. I live invaded by anxiety. And what about the money? You have carte blanche. Point 1. Absolutely. I assure you that I would give you one of the provinces of my kingdom for that photograph. And what about current expenses? The king took a heavy leather bag from inside his coat and placed it on the table. There are £300 in gold and 700 in notes, he said. Holmes wrote out a receipt for the amount on a piece of paper and handed it over. Do you know the lady's address? I ask. It's Bryony Lodge, Serpentine Avenue, St. John's Wood. Holmes took note of those data. Another question, he said, looking thoughtful. Was the photograph full body? Then, good evening, Your Majesty. I trust that soon we will have good news for you. And good night, Watson, he added as the royal carriage roared away. If you will be so good as to visit me tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock, I shall be glad to discuss this matter with you. 2. At 3 o'clock the next day I was at the house in Baker Street, but Holmes had not yet returned. The landlady informed me that she had left the house shortly after 8 in the morning. I sat down near the fire, however, intending to wait for him however long it took him to return. The new case had deeply piqued my interest, for even when I was not surrounded by the tragedy and bizarre aspects of the two crimes in which I had been involved before, the nature of the case and the importance of his client gave him special interest. My eyes. Also, quite apart from the nature of the research my friend had at hand, there was something so wonderful about his masterful command of situations and his sharp, incisive reasoning, that it was a pleasure for me to study his system of work and follow the quick and subtle methods by which he unraveled the most confusing mysteries. So used was I to his invariable success that the mere possibility of failure was inconceivable to me. It was around 4 in the afternoon when the door opened and a stable boy entered the room, dirty, bearded, with an alcoholic appearance, a swollen face and torn clothes. Although I was used to my friend's extraordinary ability to disguise himself, I had to look at him 3 times before I was sure it was really him. Nodding his head in greeting, he disappeared through the bedroom door and emerged 5 minutes later, neatly groomed and clean, and dressed as always in his cashmere suit. He put his hands in his pockets, spread his legs in front of the fire, and laughed merrily for several minutes. From time to time he would utter an unintelligible exclamation, and then continue laughing like a madman, until he was immobile, exhausted, on the chair. What are you laughing at? A funny thing. I'm sure you could never guess how I spent the morning or what I ended up doing. I can't imagine. I presume you've been watching Miss Irene Adler's habitation and probably the house. Exactly, but truly extraordinary things happened to me. I left the house shortly after 8 in the morning, disguised as a stable boy, out of work. There is a wonderful sympathy and camaraderie among the members of this profession. I soon found Bryony Lodge. It is a large villa, with a garden at the back, with a large room to the right, very well furnished, with long windows almost to the ground, secured with those English knockers that even a child can open. Besides that, it was not a notable building at all. I observed that one of the windows could be entered through the roof of the stable. I walked around the house several times, examining it from every angle, but noticing anything else that aroused my interest. I wandered in the street some time, and came to the garden side, while the grooms tended the horses. I offered to help them, and received 2d, a glass of wine, some common tobacco, and all the desirable information about Miss Adler, to say nothing of 6 other people in the neighborhood, in whom I have not the slightest interest, but whose biographies I was compelled to listen to. And what about Irene Adler? I asked for. Oh. She's driven all the men in that part of town crazy. She is the prettiest girl on this planet, in the opinion of the young men. He lives quietly, sings in concerts, goes for a walk every day at 5 and comes back for dinner exactly at 7. He rarely goes out at a different time, except when he sings. It has only one male visitor, although he is a very constant visitor. He is a tall, handsome and daring guy. he never visits her less than once a day and sometimes twice. It's a Mr. Godfrey Norton. Do you see the advantage of being a coachman's confidant? My makeshift friends have taken him to his home in the Inner Temples several times and know all there is to know about him. While I was listening to all this, I was thinking about my campaign plan. This Godfrey Norton is evidently an important factor in the affair. I learned that he was a lawyer. I could not help wondering what connection there was between them, and what was the object of their frequent visits. Was Irene his client, his friend, or his lover? In the former case, I had probably given the photograph to him for safekeeping. If the latter, it was less likely. And on this question depended whether I continued working at Bryony Lodge or turned my attention to the rooms of this one. Night in the temple, it was a delicate point and enlarged the field of my investigations. I am afraid that I am boring you with these details, but I have to explain these little difficulties to you so that you understand the situation. I listened to you with great interest, I answered. He was still mentally considering the matter when a carriage pulled up in front of Bryony Lodge and a gentleman got out. He was a remarkably handsome man, dark-haired, with regular features and a thick mustache, evidently the gentleman she had heard of. He seemed to be in a great hurry. He shouted for the coachman to wait for him and ran past the maid who opened the door for him with the confidence of a man in his own home. He was inside the house for about an hour. During this time I could see him through the window panes that correspond to the living room, turning from one side to the other and moving his arms as if he were talking with great excitement. I did not see Irene Adler during that time. At last she came out, looking more agitated than she had when she arrived. As she got into the carriage, she took a gold watch from her pocket, looked at the time, and cried out in a desperate voice. "Let's go like hell. First to Gross and Hankey, in Regent Street, and then to St. Monica's Church, in Edgware Road. Half a guinea if you can do this in 20 minutes. The coach took off and I was beginning to wonder if it might not be a good idea to follow, when a small carriage pulled out of Bryony Lodge stable. The driver was only half-buttoned in livery and unkempt tie, as if he had been hastily summoned. There had hardly been as the carriage arrived at the door of the house, Irene burst out of it and climbed just as quickly into the carriage that I only saw her for an instant, but it was enough for me to see that she was a lovely woman, with a face any man would die for. "With pleasure. To Santa Monica's Church, John," he yelled. "And I'll give you half a sovereign if you get there in 20 minutes. This was getting too interesting for me to miss, Watson. I was just beginning to consider whether I should risk being seen by getting into the back of his little carriage, when he came up on the other side of the street. A rental car. The coachman looked at me suspiciously, but I jumped into the carriage before he could protest. "To the Church of Santa Monica," I ordered him. "And half a sovereign will be yours if you arrive in 20 minutes. It was 25 minutes to 12, so it was perfectly clear what they were up to. My coachman was very good. I don't think he ever drove so fast, but the others were already there when we arrived. Irene's carriage and little carriage were at the church door. I paid the coachman and went inside. There was not a soul inside, except for the two characters I had been following, and the priest in front of them. The three of them formed a tight knot in front of the altar that I began to walk slowly down the central aisle of the ship, like any other bum who has wandered into a church for lack of anything else to do. Suddenly, to my surprise, the three people at the altar turned their faces and Godfrey Norton started running toward me. "Thank God," he cried. "You will serve us. Come on. Come on." What do you want from me? I asked. Come on, man, come on, it's only a matter of 3 minutes. If not, it won't be legal. I was nearly dragged down the aisle, and before I knew what I was doing, I was murmuring responses into my ear and declaring things I knew absolutely nothing about. I was simply helping to perform the act of marrying someone off. Irene Adler, unmarried, with Godfrey Norton, unmarried. It was all done in an instant, and I found a lady thanking me on one side, a gentleman thanking me on the other, and the priest, facing me, giving me a slight caravan. It was the strangest position I had ever found myself in, and it was the thought of it that gave me the fit of laughter I had just now. It seems there was a certain informality in his leave, and the priest refused definitely to marry them without a witness. My appearance at church saved the groom from having to run through the streets in search of a best man. The bride gave me a sovereign, and I intend to use it on my watch chain, in memory of the occasion. Things have taken an unexpected turn, I said, and then what happened? Well, I found that my plans were seriously threatened. It seemed that the couple was preparing to leave immediately, and that required swift and forceful action on my part. At the door of the church, however, they parted ways. He went to the temple and she to her own house. I'll go out to the park at 5, as usual, she said as she separated from her brand new husband. I didn't hear more. They left in different directions and I left for make my own arrangements. Which are? I asked for some cold cuts and a glass of beer, Sherlock ordered when he saw the maid come in, ignoring my question. I've been so busy I haven't had time to think about eating. And I'll be even busier this afternoon. By the way, doctor, I want your cooperation. Glad to serve you. You don't mind breaking the law? No, at all. Or run the risk of being arrested? No, if it's for a good cause. Oh, the cause is excellent. Then I'm the man you need. I already knew that I could count on you. But what do you want from me? When Mrs. Turner has brought what I asked for, I will explain myself more clearly, he said. A moment later our landlady entered with the frugal meal ordered by my friend, and he hungrily jumped on her. We shall have to discuss the matter while I eat, as I have not much time. It's almost 5. In 2 hours we have to go into action. The young lady, or rather Mrs. Irene, returns at 7 from her walk. We must be at Bryony Lodge to receive it. And what will we do then? You must leave things in my hands. I have already arranged what will happen then. There is only one point on which I must insist. You must not intervene, come what may. Understood? Should I be neutral? You shouldn't do anything at all. There will probably be some unpleasant incidents. Don't get involved in them. Events will end in leading me to the house. 4 or 5 minutes later, one of the windows in the room will open. You will then approach that open window. Yes. He'll take notice of me, because by then I'll be within his sight. Yes. And when I raise my hand, like this, he will throw what I'm going to give him into the room. And at the same time he will launch the cry of, fire. Do you get me? Perfectly. It's nothing remarkable, he said, taking a roll in the shape of a cigar from his pocket. It is an ordinary smoke rocket, which explodes by itself when it hits the ground. Its mission is specified to that. By giving the cry, you will probably attract a number of onlookers. But you must calmly walk to the corner of the street and wait for me there. I'll meet you 10 minutes later. I hope I have explained clearly. Yes. I must remain neutral, approach the open window, to observe it, and throw this object at its signal, at the same time that I launch the cry of fire. Then I'll wait for you at the corner of the street. Exactly. You can trust me. It's very nice. I think it is almost time for me to prepare myself for the new role I will have to play. He disappeared into his bedroom and returned a few minutes later in the character of a kind and simple priest of the nonconformist church. His broad black hat, his loose trousers, his white tie, his sympathetic smile, and his expression of benevolent curiosity characterized him in a truly remarkable way. It was not simply that Holmes changed his suit. Her expression, her manner, her very soul seemed to change with each new role she took on. The theater lost a magnificent actor, just as science lost an extraordinary investigator, when Sherlock Holmes decided to become a specialist in criminology. It was 6:15 when we left Baker Street and still 10 minutes to the hour when we found ourselves in Serpentine Avenue. It was already dark. And the lamps were beginning to be lighted, when we stood before Briony Lodge, awaiting the arrival of the mistress of the mansion. The house was as I had imagined from Sherlock Holmes's description, but the place seemed less peaceful than I had expected. On the contrary, for a small street, in a distant neighborhood, it was remarkably lively. There was a group of shabbily dressed men, smoking and laughing in a corner. A grinder was turning his wheel, 2 men were flirting with a servant girl, and several well-dressed young men were idling up and down the street with cigarettes in their mouths. "As you understand," remarked Holmes, as we walked past the house, "this marriage simplifies matters. Photography now becomes a double-edged sword. All the chances are that she is just as loath to be seen by Mr. Godfrey Norton as our client is to her falling into the hands of his princess. Now the question is where we can find the photograph. Where really? It is unlikely that he will bring it with him. It must be a big photo, and it's not easy for a woman to hide something like that. Besides, she's been searched twice, and she must suspect that the king is determined to repeat the feat. We can assume, then, that he does not bring it with him. Where do you have it, then? With your banker or with your lawyer? That's a double possibility, but I'm not very inclined to it. Women are discreet with their own secrets. Why should he hand her over to someone else's hands? Also, remember that you have resolved to use it in a few days. It should be at your fingertips. You must be in your own home. But, they have searched it twice. Bah! It must have been done by individuals who don't know how to search. And how are you going to search? I won't search. What will you do then? I'll have her show me where it is. He will refuse to do it. Will not be able. But I can already hear the noise of the wheels. It is his carriage. Now follow my orders to the letter. As he said so, the lights from the side lanterns of a carriage traced the curve of the avenue. It was a small carriage, which stopped at the gates of Briony Lodge. As he did so, one of the men on the corner ran to open the door, hoping to win a coin, but was pushed away by another of the bums, who had started running with the same intent. A fierce brawl began with that incident. The 2 men who had previously been flirting with the maids began to defend one of the youngsters, only making the scandal bigger with their intervention. The sharpener also intruded on the matter and delivered the first blow, aimed at one of the guards. An instant later, the lady who had descended from her carriage was the center of a small knot of men who were punching and kicking left and right. Holmes entered the crowd to protect the lady, but just as he reached his side, he gave a cry, fell to the ground, and blood began to flow profusely from his face. Seeing him fall, the guards ran in one direction and the bums in another, while a group of better-dressed people, who had watched the fight without taking part in it, scrambled away. They approached to help the girl and to attend to the wounded man. Irene Adler, as I will continue to call her, had run to the steps of her house, but as she reached the top of them, she stopped, her exceptional figure clearly outlined by the hall lights, turning her gaze towards the street. "Is the gentleman badly wounded?" I ask. "He's dead," several voices said. "Nerd." "He's still alive," someone yelled. "But he will die before he can be taken to the hospital." "He is a brave man," said a woman. "They would have taken the lady's bag and her watch, if it hadn't been for him. Those men must form a dangerous gang." "Oh. He's starting to breathe. We can't leave him lying on the street." "Couldn't we get him into your house, ma'am?" "Of course." "Bring him to the room. There is a sofa here." "Come this way, please." Slowly and solemnly my friend was led into Bryony Lodge and, lying in the main room, while I watched everything from my position near the window. The lamps had been lighted, but the draperies were not drawn, so that Holmes could be clearly seen, stretched out on the sofa. I don't know if my friend is capable of such a feeling, but I do know that I felt deeply ashamed and sorry for the mistake we were committing when I saw that most beautiful creature, against whom we were conspiring, bow down in a gesture full of grace and kindness over the injured old man. But it would have been the blackest treason against Holmes to fail him in the business with which he had entrusted me. I tried to steel my heart and took the smoke rocket out of my jacket. After all, I thought, we're not doing him any real harm. We're just stopping him from harming others. Holmes was now sitting on the sofa, and I saw him move like someone desperately in need of a breath of air. A maiden ran and opened the window. At the same instant I saw him raise a hand. It was the signal. I threw the rocket into the room and shouted at the same time, "Fire!" The word had scarcely left my mouth, when the entire crowd of onlookers, gentlemen, lads, servant girls, and tramps, joined in a general cry of "Fire! Fire!" Thick clouds of smoke billowed out of the room through the open window. Out of the corner of my eye, I perceived the running of several people into the house, and a moment later I heard Holmes's voice assuring that it was a false alarm. Slipping through the crowd of onlookers and screamers, I managed to get away from the place and to the corner of the street. 10 minutes later Holmes was at my side. He took my arm and we quietly walked away from the crazy hubbub. We walked quickly and quietly for some time, until we turned onto one of the quiet streets that lead off Edgware Road. "You behaved very well, Doctor," he commented. "Nothing could have gone better." "Do you have the photograph?" "No, but I know where it is." "And how did you find out?" "She showed me around, like I told her she would." "I still don't understand." "I don't want this to continue to seem like a mystery to you," he murmured, starting to laugh. "The matter is perfectly simple. You, of course, understood that all. People who were on the street were my accomplices. It is a group of actors that I hired for my exclusive service during these hours. I figured it. Well, when the fight started, I had some fresh red paint in my hand. I ran, dropped down, put my hand to my face and became a moving spectacle. It's an old trick. I also suspected that. Then they took me inside the house. She was not going to allow that poor old man who had saved her to stay on the street. What else could he do? And he took me to the living room, which was exactly the room where I suspected the photograph was. It had to be there, or in his bedroom. And I was determined to find out where. They laid me out on a sofa, I screamed for air, they opened the window and you did the rest. How did what I did help you? It was absolutely important. When a woman thinks that the house has caught fire, her instinct makes her run to rescue what is most valuable to her. It is an uncontrollable impulse, and more than once I have taken advantage of it. In the case of the Darlington scandal, it was of great use to me, as it was in the matter of Arnsworth Castle. A mother runs for her son, a single woman runs to rescue her jewelry. I understood that Our Lady had nothing in the house more valuable to her than the photograph we are looking for. He would run to find her, to bring her to safety. The fire alarm was perfect. The smoke and the screaming were enough to get on anyone's nerves, even the nerves of steel. Our friend reacted just as I thought. The photograph is on a secret shelf on the living room wall, just above the bell. She was there in an instant, and I caught a glimpse of her as she opened the concealed door. When I yelled that it was a false alarm, she put it back, looked at the rocket, ran out of the room, and I haven't seen her since. I got up and, after excusing myself, I left the house. I made up my mind to get hold of the photograph at once, for the coachman had come into the room and was staring at me. It seemed safer to wait. Precipitation can ruin everything. Our mission is practically finished. Tomorrow I will call the king, and with you, if you want to come, we will go directly to our little friend's house. They will take us to the living room to wait, but most likely when he arrives he will not find us, nor to the photograph. His Majesty will be pleased to recover it with his own hands. And when will we go, you say? At 8 o'clock. It won't have risen yet, so we'll have a free field. In addition, we must hurry, because this marriage can mean a complete change in your life and in your habits. I must telegraph to the king without delay. We had reached Baker Street and had stopped in front of the door. While he was looking for the keys in his pocket, someone passed saying, "Good evening, Mr. Sherlock Holmes." There were several people on the street at the time, but the greeting seemed to come from a thin young man who had come in an open carriage, but who immediately continued on his way. "I have heard that voice before," said Holmes, following the carriage, dimly lit by the light of the street lamp. "But I don't know who that young man could have been." 2. I slept that night in Baker Street, and we were enjoying our morning cup of coffee and toast, when the King of Bohemia rushed into the room. "Did you really get it?" he cried, taking Sherlock Holmes by the shoulders and looking anxiously into his face. "Not yet. But do you have hope?" "Yes, I have." "Then come on. I am impatient to leave. We'll need a car. I have my carriage outside, waiting. Then that will simplify things." We descended and set off again for Briony Lodge. "Irene Adler is married," Holmes commented. "Married? When?" "Yesterday." "But with who?" "With an English lawyer named Norton." "But, she can't love him." "I have deep hopes that you love him." "Why?" "Because it would save His Majesty from all fear of future troubles. If the lady loves her husband, she does not love His Majesty." And if you don't love your Majesty, there's no reason for you to get in the way of your Majesty's plans. It's true. And yet, well, I wish it had been my class and position. What a magnificent queen she would have been. He sighed and fell into a moody silence that wasn't broken until we reached Serpentine Avenue. The door to Briony Lodge was open, and an elderly lady stood at the top of the steps. He looked at us with a sardonic expression as we descended from the carriage. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I suppose," said he. "I am Mr. Holmes," answered my companion, with a questioning and astonished expression. "Of course." My lady assured me that it was very probable that you would come looking for her. She left this morning with her husband, on the 5:15 train. He left for the mainland. What? Sherlock Holmes staggered back, pale with anger and surprise. "Do you mean to tell me that you have left England?" "Yes, never to return." "And the papers?" the king asked hoarsely. "Everything is lost." "We'll see." He pushed the servant aside and ran into the room, followed by the king and me. Furniture was scattered in all directions, the shelves looked empty, the drawers were open. Everything seemed to indicate that the lady had quickly collected her belongings before undertaking that hasty flight. Holmes approached within the ring of the bell, opened a secret little door, and produced a photograph and a letter. The photograph was of Irene Adler herself alone, dressed in ball gown. The letter was addressed to Sherlock Holmes. My friend opened it and the three of us read it at the same time. It was dated midnight of the previous day and read as follows. "My dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes. You really did very well. I was completely surprised. Until the fire alarm I did not conceive the slightest suspicion. But then, when I found out how I had betrayed myself, I began to think. I had already been warned against you for months. I had been told that if the king employed an agent it would be you. And they gave me his address. Yet despite all this, he made me reveal what he wanted to know. Even after conceiving suspicions, I found it difficult to distrust such a gentle and ancient priest. But, as you know, I myself have studied the art of representation. The masculine costume is nothing new to me. I often take advantage of the freedom it gives. I sent John the coachman to watch you, ran up the stairs, put on my special walking suit, as I call my costume, and came down just as you were leaving. Well, I followed him to the door to make sure he was indeed an object of interest to the notorious Sherlock Holmes. So, somewhat recklessly, I bade him good night and set out for the temple, to join my husband. We both thought that the best resource was to run away, since we had a formidable antagonist in front of us. So when you come looking for us tomorrow, you'll find an empty nest. As for photography, your client can rest in peace. I love and am loved by a better man than him. The king can do what he likes, without fear of someone he cruelly betrayed intervening. I'm going to keep it as a defense. It is a powerful weapon that will defend me from any step that may be taken against me in the future. I leave you a photograph that you may want to keep. And I remain at your service, my dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, as your attentive servant. Irene Norton. Nay, Irene Adler. What a woman! Oh, what a woman! Cried the King of Bohemia when the three of us had finished reading the epistle. Didn't I tell you how quick and determined she is? Wouldn't she have been an admirable queen? Isn't it a pity that she wasn't a woman of my level? From what I have seen of that lady, it seems to me that she really is on a very different level from Her Majesty," said Holmes coldly. "I'm sorry I couldn't bring Your Majesty's business to a happier conclusion." "On the contrary, my dear sir," cried the king. "Nothing could have turned out better. I know that her word is inviolable. The photograph is now as safe as if it were on fire." "I'm glad to hear Your Majesty say that. I feel immensely grateful to you. I beg you to tell me in what way I can reward you." "This ring," he took a snake-shaped ring from his finger, with a large emerald in the center, and extended it to my friend, placing it in the palm of his hand. "Your Majesty has something worth much more to me," said Holmes. "You only have to ask." "This photography." The king looked at him with an expression of astonishment. "Irene's photograph?" "Scream dash. If you want it, it's yours. I am very grateful to Your Majesty for this. So, there is nothing more left to do in this matter. I have the honor to wish you a very good morning." He bowed and turned away, ignoring the hand the king extended to him. He left the house with me and we went back to his rooms. And that was how a scandal that threatened to seriously affect the kingdom of Bohemia ended. And that was also how Sherlock Holmes's best plans were ruined by the wit of one woman. In the past, my partner used to make fun of the supposed female intelligence, but I haven't heard of him doing it lately. And when he talks about Irene Adler, or when he refers to her photograph, he always does so under the honorable title of the woman.